Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Who is here for their first open forum? Some hands. All right. Awesome. Good new group. Well, welcome. My name is Dr. Hunter Peterson. I'm a naturopathic physician and clinic director of Coeur d'Alene Healing Arts, which is right downtown. If you want to learn more about events that the clinic does, like this one, or what our practice is all about, you could sign on to kind of our listserv where we disseminate information, and hop on over to our website if you'd like to check it out. So for those of you who aren't patients and you want to see that, I'm just going to pass around a little sign-in sheet.
I'm signed in from another.
All right, sounds good. Yeah. So this is a really fun monthly event that we do. It's not really a lecture series. It's called Open Forum because I really want it to be more like a discussion. It's an opportunity for us all to get together and have uninterrupted time to talk about health. So even though there's a topic I prepare, I want it to very much be something where you interrupt me and you ask questions along the way. Let's dive into different topics and kind of get off track. That's totally fine. However, I will allocate the earlier portion of our lecture to really covering, that topic that you guys all read about that I'll be presenting on, food as medicine. Just so everyone knows, as you might have seen, I was turning on a video camera. So if you want to rewatch this, take some more notes, share it with a friend, we post these to YouTube every month. So those will also be up on our website. And as I said, if you want to learn more about our clinic, there's more info at the back of the room. So I usually like to start our session off by asking if there are any questions anyone would like answered tonight. It could be about anything. So who wants to start us off? Yes?
Eye cataract prevention.
Eye cataract prevention. Okay. Yes, Neil?
Can you talk about nightshades?
Yeah, the nightshade and the vegetables.
First they're not good for you, and then they're good for you, and then they cause arthritis, and then they're...
Right.
Okay, gotcha. We'll chat about them. Yes?
Do you cover anything regarding arthritis and food you might take to prevent or help it along?
Which type of arthritis are you referring to? Osteoarthritis or rheumatoid arthritis, or
My brother has he just does arthritis.
Okay, probably osteoarthritis. So the question would be food-based treatments for arthritis, osteoarthritis. Okay, yeah. And these two kind of they go together a little bit, anyways. Okay.
Yeah. There seems to be a furor going about how coconut oil is harmful for you.
Okay. So discuss the health
Discuss that.
properties
Yeah.
of coconut oil? Okay. Sure. Yes.
About kidney stones.
Kidney stone, what causes them, how to treat them?
Actually, how to shrink them.
How to shrink them. Okay. We'll probably get into what causes them too. Did particular type of stone, or
No,
it's okay?
I know there's different kinds.
Okay. Yeah.
I have anything regarding bioidentical hormones.
Okay. In terms of, give me a little more context. That's a big topic.
Well, in terms as far as like, rather than going the traditional route of HRT,
Yeah.
bioidentical hormones.
Yeah,
like
to differentiate. Yeah.
versus just eating yams or something.
Okay. Yeah. So, and is it kind of in the context of menopause then? We're really thinking about
Osteoporosis.
And osteoporosis. Okay. I'll just abbreviate that. So
connection or what foods to help fight the inflammation for autoimmune.
Okay, so, and I'll just write anti-inflammatory, you're thinking food specifically? Okay.
Is there anything to do to this food combining? This is something I've heard lately.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes?
Can you talk about lectins? My green drink has lectins in it, and I don't know if I should find a different one. For
Okay.
weight loss.
Okay, lectins.
Yeah.
You said in relation to weight loss, or just talk a little bit about lectins? Okay. Yeah, sounds good. Yes, back.
Maybe naturally lowering high blood pressure,
Okay.
cholesterol, specifically triglycerides, real high.
Yes.
And have you heard of this Arctic ruby oil?
You know, I haven't.
Okay.
It has a catchy name though, huh?
Yeah, really catchy.
I have not heard that.
Okay.
Anything else? Yes.
Benefits of apple cider vinegar,
Okay.
are you familiar with that?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll just write ACV
Okay.
and benefits. Okay. Any more?
Weight loss?
Weight loss. Just how to go about weight loss, basically.
And
Okay.
stay healthy.
Okay, sure, yeah. That's a big one too, but I can take a little crack at it. Okay, one more.
You touch on dementia.
Dementia in what context?
Maybe things to help for further progression.
Okay. All right. Cool. We got one more? Okay. Yeah,
Vitamins, it's like, I never know what one to get.
yeah.
I mean, how do you know what brand is
Yeah.
better? Is it, it's a tough one.
We might have to truncate that one just because that's like a whole open forum in and of itself. And I've done a lecture on that, it might be on our website.
Oh.
So you might want to take a peek there.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. This is plenty. So again, what we're gonna do here is, because if we do this, we end up, moving through the time, and I want to make sure that people who came to learn about the topic I prepared get an opportunity. So this will be at the end of the lecture. We'll dive through all these questions. Sound good? Okay. All right. So I felt like in the summer months, it's kind of a time where everyone's, growing their gardens. We're having barbecues. It's kind of, I don't know, a good time to be more focused on live, fresh foods. So I thought, well, let's talk about food as medicine. And it's something that's very fun for me because it's kind of my job. I get to do that every day. And it's interesting that, in the conventional medical field, we have created such a, what I call reductionistic view of medicine, that everything is simply broken down into its constituent parts and then amplified. I mean, that's basically what a drug is taking a natural substance, somehow extracting it and then amplifying its potency. But I find in my field that I can treat very, very serious disease processes, especially of chronic nature, using food. And it's much using the right foods as it's not using the wrong foods, right? So I find that most disease for many people originates in the realm of eating foods that, as a unique individual, someone does not assimilate well. Their body does not have a friendly relationship to it. And so this lecture is, in its scope, not really going to tackle that individuality of foods. I mean, I'm going to talk about the nightshade family and certain things related to those questions, but really today's lecture is more focused on, let's pretend everyone has an equal, I guess, relationship with every food, that everybody's body is able to assimilate each food group, and what are the nutrient values, what are the constituents in that creates health or takes it away. So I just want to make that little caveat because it's important that it's not a one-size-fits-all model, but to really get personalized about that, we have to know each individual's unique health picture, their genetics, their family history, their unique health history, their biography, and the symptoms that are presenting. So if someone has migraines, I'm obviously going to emphasize certain foods more than another. And I will, to an extent, get into that context of discussing nutrients and, generally speaking, what types of conditions they can be used to treat. And that all being said, because of the nature of this, I can't just go food by food and talk through all the nutrients in it, because we would literally be here for days and days. So what I am going to do is actually focus more on the nutrients and then broaden out about what are good sources of that from food, what are highly concentrated in those nutrients, and then generally speaking, the mechanism or the physiology of how those nutrients work in the body, and then what conditions indicate specific emphasis on those foods. Okay. So the starting point, though, I think, is to almost talk a little bit about, before we break down individual foods, well, what is a healthy diet? And I know that's a million-dollar question, and there's a lot of different interpretations, but I really want to just start with what the standard American diet is versus what our ancestral diet is. And when I say the standard American diet, really what I'm referring to is, in the last 100 years, or more like 50 years, the epidemic of consuming processed food. What is a processed food? Well, essentially a processed food is anything from which you take the live plant and do any sort of refinement or processing of it. So essentially anything that comes in a package, in a box, in a bag, anything that doesn't look like the food that you would find growing in the ground, it's been processed. And it's argued that the American diet, calorically speaking, the standard person is up to about 70% to 80% processed food, and that's average. So that means some people are up at 90, 95% consuming processed food. And there's obviously a lot of problems with that. First of all, you're not getting any of the, I should say you're getting a small fraction of the nutrients contained in those foods, because the processing removes all the parts of the plant that are actually valuable nutritionally speaking. It doesn't take the calories out, it doesn't take the salt out, it doesn't take the sugar out. Usually when it's processed, they actually add those things because it makes us crave them more and makes us get addicted faster. So again, when we talk today, almost precursor to the lecture is that we're talking about a whole foods diet, meaning that plants and animal products where you are able to tell where it came from by looking at it. And that's a general rule of thumb that we should all have when we shop for the foods that we eat, is that, you know, we basically want to be on the edges of the grocery store where there's the fresh food, or the bulk section where you pull things out of bins. Everything else really doesn't belong in our diet, I would say. So that's one thing to consider. Now, then you get to the point where, okay, we're talking about nutrient values of foods. Well, doesn't how you cook it have something to do with that, and how you store it have something to do with that? Yes, absolutely. And again, I'm going to do a really abbreviated version of talking about that, because it could also be a lecture in and of itself, and we can go into individual families of vegetables and families of fruits and talk about the best types and the best ways to store them and the best ways to prepare them. But just to be really straightforward, one of the things that happens in the summer is there's a lot of barbecuing, right? Everyone's been doing that. Well, it turns out that barbecuing is probably not the best way to cook your food, because a lot of it has to do with the heat. The higher the heat you cook something in, the more quickly it alters the chemical structure of your foods. So unless you can have a barbecue like one of those eggshell ones where the coals are way down low and the meat is really up high, then you're heating that meat up really high. And if you actually brown the meat or char the meat, you're making a lot of carcinogens, which are essentially cancer-promoting compounds. So even if you do that, it's good to cut that part of the meat off. Particularly, one of the most devastating parts of eating really highly cooked meat is what's called glycosylated end products. So anytime you combine a protein with any sort of carbohydrate, which is any glaze you put on it, barbecue sauce, anything but simple spices, you essentially, when you heat it, create what's called glycated end products. And these compounds are highly, highly damaging to your tissues in your body. Like a hot dog has something like 10,000 units in it, because hot dogs have sugar in them. That's a lot of units versus if you were cooking a head of broccoli, it might have like 20 units in it. Okay, so we got to be really careful heating meat in the combination of some sort of sugar in it. Yeah?
Are you talking about heating it to a high temperature or a speed at which you're heating it at?
It's a high temperature. It doesn't necessarily matter the speed.
Okay.
Yeah, good question. So generally speaking, as it goes in tiers of cooking, probably barbecuing is one of the worst ways to prepare things. Probably followed closely by, yeah, well, I guess I would say frying is right up there, right? Like deep frying things. That's not good either, because we got to talk about oils, another constituent. So, you know, we talk about certain vegetable oils being very healthy. Well, what happens when you heat them up and you make French fries? Well, all of those oils, which are super fragile, get interconverted into very unstable fats called trans fats. You've all probably heard about that. So anytime you eat a fried food, you're eating a whole bunch of trans fats, which, again, are really devastating to the chemistry of your tissues. So another way to ideally never consume food. If you go down the line in terms of what kind of devitalizes food, I would put microwaving probably right in there next. If you look at the scientific studies, they're going to say, oh, microwaving is pretty similar to boiling, etc. But I think what the observation has been on a much more complex level is that the food becomes devitalized much more quickly. And the way that I think about that is that microwaves are essentially emitting a wave frequency into that food. And a lot of the vitality of our foods have to do with the electromagnetic resonance of that food. So when you microwave something, you really screw that up, and that has a very devitalizing effect on the food. Okay. So then we have things like sauteing. It's a pretty decent way to cook food if you're using a nice stable oil, like a saturated fat, like clarified butter. You don't want to use plant fats, like even olive oil. When you're sauteing, it's too high of heat. So you want to use more saturated stuff. Certain nut oils are pretty saturated as well. And by the way, anytime you cook something in a pan, vegetables especially lose their water, is what we say. Well, guess what's in all the water? Most of the nutrients, okay, or a very large portion of them. So ideally, whenever you cook something, you're also consuming the liquid that is part of that composition in one way or another. That makes sense? Okay. And then there's obviously boiling, which if you boil something and then throw out the water, you're going to lose a certain proportion of what you boil. There's roasting, which is, again, a pretty high heat method of cooking. So you can lose a good bit of the nutrients that way. So essentially, the concept is really the lower the heat, the better. So like steaming, lightly steaming is probably the optimal way to consume food, in the sense that you make it the bonds in those foods a little bit broken down so they're easier to assimilate, but you lose a minimal amount of the nutrients. Raw food is probably the most nutrient dense, but the trade-off there is that in order to absorb the raw foods completely, you have to have really good digestive fiber. And honestly, I don't see many patients who the state of their digestion is in such high efficiency that they can really assimilate raw really well. And when we cook things, what we do is we concentrate the nutrients, right? Everything shrinks down, becomes easier to assimilate. So even though you lose some of the minerals and vitamins in the process, you make it much more dense. So there's kind of a trade-off there, is I guess what I want to say. People with really deficient digestive systems or more elderly, I don't recommend they do a lot of raw food. It's just harder to assimilate. Now that also has a little bit of a seasonal variation. I think by our design, our capabilities change with the seasons. So in the summertime, I'm telling people to eat a lot more fresh fruits and vegetables, raw foods, do some juicing. In this winter, I'm counseling a lot of people to eat a lot of hearty soups and bone broths and cooked foods. Because I think our bodies, especially if you look at it from the Chinese medicine standpoint, really have a differentiated need depending on the time of year. So questions about the kind of preparation methods, some of the bad products you can create by cooking the wrong ways. Yeah.
I've noticed that avocado oil says that it's good up to like 500 degrees.
Yeah.
Would that seem?
It's a good high heat cooking oil. Yeah. Yeah.
What about coconut oil?
Coconut oil, also a good high heat cooking oil. Yeah.
So how would you prepare a steak?
Yeah.
You can't fry it, barbecue it, or...
Yeah. Well, you know,
Another
it's,
steak.
yeah, if you're gonna eat, you know, some sort of meat, boiling is one of the less carcinogenic and glycated in product ways to do it. So boiling could be done, but you're not really going to boil a steak usually. So I would, if you are okay with doing it more on the rare side, I would just do, you know, a light pan searing on either side in a stable oil, and eat it, you know, pretty on the rare side.
I was wondering if, you know, like on barbecue, indirect.
Yeah, and indirect heat could work as well. I mean, it's all about the temperature gradient, right? So the more distance you can put on your barbecue, the better. The lower the heat you know, set the barbecue at, the better. And make sure you don't char it, or if you do, chop the pieces off.
Just saying cook low and slow.
Yeah, that's basically what I'm saying, exactly. It's a good synthesis. Yeah, Jen.
I haven't been able to find information, data, that, I've heard that microwaving, I've heard from you and Dr. Todd that microwaving isn't good for cooking, but I haven't been able to find any data about that.
And that was the preface I made, is that if you go look for the research, it'll essentially say, yeah, I mean, the nutrient values in the foods are the same. But I think that many of us can observationally attest to the fact of, you know, microwaving versus heating something on the stove. There's a different quality to the food. And I certainly think if you look at the electromagnetics and the fact that every cell in our body and every constituent in a plant substance has a resonant frequency, that subjecting it to intensive amounts of microwaves, that wavelength can really disrupt that elegant chemistry of the compound. And in that sense, unfortunately, the research just isn't quite there, right? Because we have this very reductionistic view of food. It's just, oh, it's its individual parts. So if we measure the nutrients, the food is the same. I think it's much more of a complex picture, man. I mean, we could use the argument too, like, how about the food you eat fresh out of your garden versus the stuff that, you know, you get in the grocery store that came from 2,000 miles away? It tastes better, right? I mean, there's a lot of different reasons for that, but that's another example. So another caveat to make here in terms of when we're talking about nutrient values is organic versus conventional, right? It's been very widely recognized and researched that things that are raised organically have, generally speaking, 1/4 to 1/2 higher levels of most nutrients than conventionally raised. That's not every food, but generally speaking, that's what it looks like. So again, when we can afford it and make it work, way better to go organic. And I always tell my patients, especially if you need to allocate your resources, I would do it on the animal products, because those products concentrate toxins an order of magnitude of 10 to 100 times. Okay, so if you're eating cow, that cow has eaten about 100 times worth of grasses, and so it's accumulating all of that debris up the food chain. So you ideally want to make good choices of grass-fed and organic of any sort of animal product, eggs, meat, poultry, fish.
Do you differentiate between commercially organic grown versus, like,
Yeah.
regular old people grown?
Yeah, it's a good question. So to become organic certified, there is a lot of regulatory work. So very small farms and outfits, it's cost prohibitive for them to attain that status. And that's where you kind of like, it's the saying is like, you got to know your neighbor. It's like, ask your neighbor how they raise their animals, because just because it's not organic doesn't mean it's not high quality. So a lot of the farmers markets, you'll see their produce is not technically organic because they didn't go through the certification process. Whereas you can go to Costco and get organic, spinach that's from 1,000 miles away, and I would take the spinach from the farmers market any day. So it's a little confusing there because, and that you just ask the local people, like, how do you raise this? And you can differentiate that. Now, another question with meat becomes grass-fed versus organic, right? So, I would counsel someone to consume grass-fed beef versus organic grain-fed beef, because it dramatically alters the chemical profile, the nutrient profile of that livestock, basically. So our ancestral animals that we hunted obviously didn't eat corn, they ate grass. And so the health values are very different in relation to where those animals are getting their food. That makes sense. Yeah?
Where would home canned food, both vegetables and meats, fall on your list from raw?
Canned food?
Yeah.
Yeah, I still would call it a processed food. It's ideal to get the bulk. Are you talking about like beans and stuff?
Home canning, yeah, beans, tomatoes.
Oh, home canning.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, it's a good way to preserve the nutrients. I'm going to touch in on what are called phytonutrients or phytochemicals. A lot of what we eat in our plants are the antioxidants and the anti-inflammatory species that are part of the structure of the plant. And a lot of those degrade with freshness and with time. So you do miss out on some of that, but some of them actually concentrate with time. So generally speaking, as I said, it's kind of in that same boat. Always probably most nutritionally valuable to consume raw or fresh, but secondarily, if they're home canned, it's a pretty good way to preserve the nutritional value. Or flash frozen, also good. If you're buying stuff out of the store, I kind of tell people fresh first, then frozen, and then canned, because conventionally canned products have a lot of additives in them and preservatives, which aren't so good.
Yeah, that's what about freeze drying.
What's that?
What about freeze drying?
Yeah, I was mentioning freeze drying. Good way to preserve nutrient value. You lose some of the phytochemicals, but very few. Yeah.
How about vacuum sealing?
Well, vacuum sealing is a way to encapsulate something. The problem I have the biggest there is it's in plastic, which has a lot of toxic compounds that can leach into the food, especially if it's a fatty food.
Or if you're lucky, if it will fit, if you use glass.
Yeah, and glass is ideal. Like if you're making pesto every year, it's best to put it in a glass jar and keep it in your freezer if you can manage that.
You usually need to freeze it first before you vacuum seal it, because if you vacuum seal it first, you might break your jar.
Right. There you go.
I have a neighbor who grows his own cows. He gets some small in the spring and then slaughters them in the fall.
Right.
And they just eat in the field, grass, just the whole time. But I think the last 2 weeks he feeds them corn, probably GMO corn.
Yeah, to fatten them up.
Yeah.
Yeah, so really what the term, that's a good clarification. When I talk about grass-fed, the differentiating term that you need to be careful about is grass-finished. Right, so that means they had grass all the way through. Versus a lot of people do grain-finish their cows, which bulks them up by maybe 15–20% of their weight, and that all turns into fat.
So it's a big
in the
difference.
wrong kind of fat. Yeah, it is.
Oh, okay.
It is a big difference, yeah. So you want grass-finished.
Argument's sake, though, can't they be grain-fed and then grass-finished?
I guess they could. I don't know that anyone does it that way. It's possible, though. I think most people go the other way around. Technically, you're right. It could.
Because then you can sell it as grass-fed, which you can get a higher premium for.
Sure.
The whole time you're being
Sure. That's true. I don't think that's part of the industry that much, but I'm not the total expert in that arena. Okay. So I'm going to dive into the main kind of meat of our topic. And I guess I want to start by kind of breaking down the main constituents in our food, just so that we all have some perspective. So we all know about the food groups, right? We have various forms of meat. So we have, red meat, we have poultry, we have fish, we have eggs, which is kind of not really meat, but not really a plant. So it's an animal product. We have dairy, which is a different animal product. And that's kind of our realm of animal foods. And then we have the realm of plants, which is nuts and seeds, vegetables, fruit, and grains. And oils, right? So oils are usually a distillation of either a vegetable or a nut or seed. So that's kind of like, in terms of foodstuffs, that's what we're working with, unless I missed something. Okay, no one can think of anything. Within those, we break, in conventional medicine, it basically goes, this is the last step it goes to, which is protein, fat, and carbohydrate. Okay. And that's true, those are our major macronutrients in our foods. Without each of those, none of us could live. Okay, so our fats have massive implications to the architecture of the cell membranes, to our neurological system. The conduction pathways need fats. Cholesterol we all demonize, but without cholesterol we couldn't have hormones. A lot of roles fats play in the human body. It's also a very dense form of energy storage. So if we were to go without food for a long time, fats would really save us because they give us twice the energy per unit as carbohydrates and protein. And the main sources of fats are oils, as I said, nuts and seeds, very high fat content, certain animal products such as dairy and eggs and fish have pretty high fat content. Certain fish, not white fish, but oily fish. And certain forms of red meat, which I don't love to mention just because it's probably not a good source of fat, but that's also a source. If we move to the realm of protein, we have animal-based sources of protein and plant-based sources of protein. So in the animal realm, obviously all different types of meat. The egg whites, as differentiated from the yolks, which is mostly fat, the whites are protein. So we have dairy, all forms of dairy except for milk. Milk has very little protein, but the other forms have a lot. Yogurt, cheese, eggs, all forms of meat. So all of our animal products basically have some level of protein in them. And most meat is just almost exclusively protein with a little bit of fat. And then in the animal or in the plant realm, we have nuts and seeds, good protein content. Legumes or beans, very good protein content. Small protein content in grains, very small, but when combined with legumes makes actually a complete protein, meaning sharing all of the amino acids that are essential for human health. And then other sources of protein from the plant world, those are pretty much the main ones. So we can do derivatives like pea proteins or soy derivatives, things like that, but ultimately they all come from usually a legume source or a nut and seed source, with very trace amounts in vegetables and in grains. Okay. And then last of all, carbohydrates. So,
Could I interrupt?
yeah, sure.
Where do you put rice in that protein thing?
Rice is a grain, and it has very little protein in it.
Okay.
And so there are some grains that have more, like quinoa has more protein than rice per se.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, grains have very little trace amounts.
I asked the question because I always get mixed up with, when you speak of seed, I think of a grain as a seed, so it's sort of...
Yeah, and seeds are totally different, right? Seeds, just think about their use, right? They contain a lot of energy in them because they're supposed to make a whole plant. So they have a lot of fat, a lot of protein. It's a good dense form of energy. That's why most seeds come out in the fall. We can harvest them and store them and eat a lot of them because it has a lot of fat in it. In the realm of carbohydrates, so our main sources of caloric carbs, and let me differentiate between carbs that contain calories and carbs that don't. That's really important. Caloric carbs are all grains, have a lot of carbohydrate load. Most fruit has carbohydrate load. Differing fruits have differing sugar content, right? We're talking about sugar is a carbohydrate, but so is starch. So those are our main types of caloric carbs. And we have legumes have some carbs in them. Nuts and seeds have some carbs in them. And dairy, depending on what type, can have a little bit of carbs. Interestingly, the standard American diet is about 80% caloric carbohydrate. Well, it's because of all of our processed food, right? All of those added sugars we're consuming, all those refined grains, wheat, corn, potato products, fast food, breads, pastas, you know, that's all caloric, starchy carbs or sugars. But we have this whole other side of the coin with carbohydrates, which a lot of us don't think about, but what is the first nutrient that I'm actually going to start with? And that's fiber. Okay? So we don't really think about the health value of fiber, but it has a huge role to play in human health. And so when I talk about the good carbs for most people, because most people eat too many calories from carbs, I talk about vegetables, because vegetables, fibrous ones, that is, excluding corn and potatoes, are made mostly of nutrients and fiber and very little calories. So if you're wanting to lose weight, that was someone's question, eat a lot of vegetables, right? Because you're getting all this fiber that satiates you, you're getting all these nutrients, and you're not getting any calories. So the historical or ancestral human diet is about 70 to 80% fibrous vegetables. So I always say, let's copy nature or look to nature in terms of how we should eat or do anything really. And so in that sense, I mean, is there anybody in here that could say that their diet is that high in fibrous veggies? I don't think I'm quite there. Right, so that's a lot. But why is that so valuable health-wise? Well, as I said, because a lot of the nutrients are in those foods, but fiber has this huge role to play in our health. The typical American diet has about 10 grams of fiber. The optimal optimal diet should have about 50 grams of fiber per day. Okay, and that's two forms you can have it in. You can have it in soluble fiber or insoluble. What that really means is that insoluble fiber essentially is just roughage, or it just passes through. Nothing really happens to it. No enzymes can digest it anywhere in the body. Soluble fiber is a little different in that certain microbes in your intestines can actually ferment that fiber and use it for a food source. Well, why is that a big deal? Well, because we have 100 times more bacteria that live in our guts than we have cells in our body. So, you know, that just to give perspective, right? We got a lot of organisms in our guts, and they're playing a dramatic role in our health, literally touching into every spectrum of our well-being, from our digestion, which is very obvious, but to our mood, to our energy, to our metabolism, to our sleep, to our stress. I mean, these bacteria have a profound role. And so keeping those bacteria healthy is a huge part of good nutrition and the nutritional value of our food. And so, again, eating those really high fiber foods is critical to a good diet and to keeping those bacterial colonies really healthy and to keeping our bowels really normal. And I mean, the research is just exploding here. So we're even finding that people who are obese have dramatically different bacteria than people who are thin. And one of the main ways scientifically to intervene there is to feed a high fiber diet, and all those bacteria change around and people lose weight, even if they don't change their calorie intake. Okay, so that's just like one little snippet, but it illustrates a point. Yeah.
I have a question on that then. Should you be supplementing with like some kind of fiber supplement?
Good question. Well, you know, I supplement mostly all of the nutrients I'm going to talk about today in some form or another in people who are deficient. But the concept is, in my motto in my private practice is, you know, we want to use food as medicine as much as possible. We want to use the least amount of supplementation necessary to achieve optimal health. Now, someone who comes in really, really sick, we might need to use a few more nutrients because their organ systems and tissues are very devitalized. But I don't think anyone should have to supplement fiber because that's taking a shortcut over eating a healthy diet. If I were to supplement it, I like to do it in a food-based form, so I usually tell people to eat ground flax, ground chia, or ground milk thistle as probably my favorite sources of supplemental fiber. And it goes great like in a smoothie, but you could sprinkle it on food or even just put it in water. Why ground? Because you actually get to take on the nutrients from those seeds, versus if you eat them whole, they're good fiber, but you don't get the nutrient benefit from them. And I'll go pretty high. I mean, I'll have people, if there's major digestive issues, constipation, go to 4 tablespoons a day, up to, as long as you're hydrating well enough. That's a big caveat. If you're not hydrating, you can get very constipated. So, but generally speaking, yes, you could supplement, and that's a way to go. And I think it's a good adjunctive because it, just like most of us don't eat 80% of our food as vegetables, most of us probably aren't getting 50 grams of fiber a day. So it'd be a nice way to, I think every tablespoon of ground chia is about 5 grams of fiber, and it's soluble. So whole grains are another great source of fiber. Legumes are an awesome source of soluble fiber. Both beans or legumes and whole grains are soluble, which is nice. You get that extra benefit to the bacteria. Nuts and seeds have a really good portion of fiber in them. Really, all plants have great fiber. It's the animal kingdom that doesn't. Or processed food, right? What's the main thing that we do in processing food? We take all the fiber out, right? And you might think, well, it doesn't change the nutrition of the food. Well, it absolutely does, especially when you start to appreciate how important that fiber is to our well-being. So any questions on fiber? Okay. I know it's a weird nutrient to start on, but it's a big one.
Doctor, is there any ratio between soluble and non-soluble?
You know, I think, you know, if you're looking at vegetables being mostly insoluble, I think probably 2/3 insoluble, 1/3 soluble is probably a realistic ratio.
Okay.
It could be up to 50-50, but yeah.
In a Vitamix, if I throw in like all the berries or whatever,
Yeah.
and I use the Vitamix, is the fiber still in there, right?
Oh, yeah.
So it doesn't
Yeah, and
change
I
that.
forgot fruit. Of course, fruit is a big source of fiber. That's why even though fruit has a lot of sugar, it's dramatically different than drinking juice, because juice, one of the main things, it pulls all the fiber out. So when people talk about juicing and there's this big, you know, juice bars all over, juicing is a great way to concentrate nutritional value, but if you're doing it with a bunch of fruit, you're really concentrating sugars. And you're removing all that fiber, which has a really great nutritional value in and of itself. And so I don't really guide people to juice on a really frequent basis. I often do it in the context of a juice fast, which is an opportunity for the body to do a lot of detoxing and repairing. But generally speaking, I would consider any sort of juice or soda or sweetened beverage or alcohol a highly processed food. If it's a true fruit juice you've actually pressed, obviously that's the highest quality of everything, but all the rest would not be ideally regularly consumed foods. So water would be, your primary go-to beverage. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned juicing fruit. Do you feel the same way about juicing vegetables?
No, vegetables are great to juice. You gotta be a little careful with things like beets and carrots. They have high sugar content, but generally speaking, it's great. Yeah. So kind of right in line with fiber, I just want to mention fermented food. A lot of us take probiotics, right? Well, the concept there is, we have all these bugs in our gut and they are really important, so let's consume a supplement that helps keep those bacteria healthy. So our ancestors didn't have probiotics, right? They had the food that they ate, and then they had methods of fermentation. So first of all, great reason to grow a garden. When you pull that food out of the soil and dust it off, it's got all sorts of gut-friendly microbes on it. When you buy it that's been shipped 1,000 miles, you don't have those. Okay, so that's first of all, you get that access to the microbes, but secondarily, fermented foods, right? Historically, culturally, many societies ferment their foods, and it's a very simple process of adding salt and water and some sort of culture or a little bit of sugar to have those plants chew on and essentially ferment your vegetables. And there's certain cultures that do a lot of it, like the Japanese eat fermented soy in the form of tempeh and miso. In our culture, the main thing I think about is a lot of people eat sauerkraut, which is a pretty good one. But you can ferment all sorts of vegetables. You can ferment beets and onions and carrots. And you got to be careful about how you buy them. If you buy, standard sauerkraut at most conventional grocery stores, they've essentially been, they've gone through the process of high heating called pasteurization, because that's the only way they can cover their butts for legal purposes if someone got sick. But of course you kill all the microbes. So if you want like a real sauerkraut, they have it here. It's called Bubby's. It's a really good one to eat. And so you got to be careful when you buy fermented foods in the store. Is it truly fermented or has it been pasteurized? Same story with yogurt. Right, dairy is another source of fermented foods, but most yogurt has been pasteurized. So like I really like the Bulgarian yogurt they have here because it hasn't been pasteurized. And it has way high levels of live cultures. Yeah?
Speaking of yogurt real quick, what's your thoughts on A1 versus A2 dairy?
Yeah, there's different cows, and certainly there's a subset of the population that's more reactive to, I think it's the A1?
A1.
Yeah, the A1 than the A2 strain. So my general feedback on dairy, which so I'm not going to emphasize it a ton tonight, is so many people are intolerant to cow dairy that even though there's a high nutrient density or fermented value, that first thing I started with, that we're all individual and certain foods were not designed to digest, I find that the majority of my patients don't do well assimilating dairy. And for that reason, even though dairy is a high source of calcium, I emphasize other sources of calcium. Or dairy is a high source of B vitamins, I emphasize other sources, because so many people have problems assimilating.
Even if it's raw, like raw milk?
Mm-hmm. Less so, because the enzymes are already in there, but I do, for a very small subset of people, they do fine with dairy, but I don't really think humans are that well designed to digest, cow's milk, and it's a very complex molecule. It takes a lot of effort for the system to do it, and all the enzymes for that are right along the edge of your intestines, and they're the first ones to go with any sort of gut issues.
So you're saying better to use like almond milk?
Yeah. Yeah, I recommend almond milk a lot, unsweetened almond milk
Unsweetened,
or
yeah.
unsweetened hemp milk. Yeah, those are really good choices, and they fortify them. That's actually a really good thing to mention is you'll read nutrition textbooks and they'll say, oh, great source of vitamin B2 is cereal, right? Well, it's because they take a synthetic vitamin and they throw it in that processed food, and they say, oh, well, you're getting all your nutrition. Not really. It's unfortunately not that simple. Because the value of the food is in it. It's in the combined parts that make up the whole, not that reductionistic model of let's throw this nutrient and throw that nutrient and it makes a healthier food. But from the realm of food science, that's how the last 30, 40 years have evolved, is to create value by saying which vitamins and which concentrations in the food.
That yogurt you were talking about earlier, the one that...
Yeah.
What was the name of it?
It's called Bulgarian yogurt. I'm trying to remember.
Is that full fat or
Yeah.
not low fat?
Yeah, full fat.
Full fat.
Yeah. Yes.
I take supplements instead of eating sauerkraut because I really don't like the taste of
Yeah.
fermented foods.
And that's fine.
But if
I do too.
If I was to try to open my mind and force myself to eat it half a cup a day, once a week.
Yeah, good question. I would say for most people, a quarter of a cup a day would be plenty of fermented foods, even if, a few tablespoons. You don't have to
Every
just...
day though.
Yeah, every day.
Okay.
Yeah, ideally every day.
And is the apple cider vinegar, does that give you probiotics? Does that
No.
have something that's good for your gut?
Not, I mean, sure, it's more acidifying to the stomach is why people really like it, but not really from the standpoint of microbial species. Of course, the other things you guys have probably heard about, kombucha and kefirs. Not a huge fan of those in the sense that you have to make them super tart to actually ferment the sugars out of them. So they might taste really good, but you're drinking a lot of sugar too. So you got to be careful about that.
Is this where you could use the apple cider vinegar?
No.
No?
Yeah, vinegar can help ferment things, but in and of itself, you usually have a culture to start it with, and it turns
No, I meant
into...
with just drinking it in water.
Well, certainly you can drink it in water for different health properties.
But it's not getting
Not a probiotic.
probiotic,
Yeah. Yes.
okay.
Right. Oatmeal?
Goat,
Oh, goat milk?
this is common.
Yeah, goat and sheep are much better tolerated by the vast majority of humans. And so if we're talking not about nutrient values, but about food intolerance, I mean, I would then go on to say, yeah, probably better choices if you're going to have dairy, for sure. Yes?
Can you weigh in on the, you mentioned kefir versus cottage cheese. I use that protein to combine with my flax fat.
Yeah.
Is there one that's...
Well, I mean, the cottage cheese is going to have a lot less probiotic in it and probably, a little more sugar in it. So in the sense that probably kefir would be maybe a better lean. But again, it's a cow product, so I wouldn't use that as your main source of fermentation unless, you're one of those unique people who can process dairy really, really well. As a staple. Doesn't mean here and there to input it wouldn't be good. And that's just, again, my viewpoint. It might be different for you. Yeah. So probiotics, I just wanted to make mention of that. It's a nutrient. It can be created at home. Can be bought in the store. Or it can be taken as a supplement, of course. But really, a healthy human should be consuming some probiotics in some fashion every day to keep those microbes well informed and healthy.
Is there a brand you recommend?
I use a few different ones depending on the situation. I really like soil-based probiotics. Soil-based. They come from the soil. Yeah.
Not soy.
Yeah.
Regarding the probiotics, I had heard that if it does not require refrigeration, that it's not a good source. Is that true or not true?
Depends on what type they are. So,
Okay.
soil-based ones don't need refrigeration.
Okay,
They're heat stable.
okay.
But many others do, and that's a good question to make.
If you ferment your own vegetables, with your own whatever, is it gonna have the same bacteria in it
Yeah.
as it comes out of the store?
Yeah, or even more, or even better ones, better colony counts. Yeah, definitely best to ferment it yourself.
You have.
Yeah.
Can you tell us how to do it?
I was gonna ask.
Yeah.
I've tried before.
Yeah, I mean, you essentially need some sort of bacterial starter, salt, and sometimes a little vinegar, and you usually cover it just to the surface with liquid, and then keep it in a close container.
Heat it up first?
Not necessarily, just room
I've tried,
temperature.
it didn't really work. So
Yeah, you can do it at room temperature, but it takes a little while to do it, usually a few weeks, depending on the veggies you're doing, and depending on how thinly you slice it. And again, really good recipes online of how to ferment foods. Yeah.
Soil
Or-
based?
Soil based, yeah, like Prescripticus is the one we use at our clinic.
Yeah, but when you say soil based, you mean plant?
It means comes from the dirt.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why it's great to have kids play in the dirt, you know, they get all these good bacteria. Yeah, and the fiber from the soil. Yeah. Yeah.
Is buttermilk any different than any other dairy product for probiotics?
Well, it has higher fat content, and it would have probiotics if it wasn't pasteurized, but it always is. So probably not a great choice overall. Yeah.
Can you say something about prebiotics?
Yeah, prebiotics are what the bacteria eat, right? So any sort of starch that you eat is a prebiotic. Soluble fiber is prebiotics. That's what it is, right? It's what the microbes can consume. So a lot of companies will issue a probiotic with prebiotic, the idea being that those microbes will feed on it. I personally don't really believe in that because the gut's way more complicated than that. So I generally don't like my patients on prebiotics because they can create a lot of gassiness and a lot of people get side effects.
So just eat enough fiber and that will feed.
Oh yeah, yeah, totally. So I'm going to move on here just so we can get through some topics. We started talking about, plants, vegetables, fruit, and what the, standard nutrition industry is not going to talk about is the immense number of plant constituents that create a live vegetable or a live fruit. And that's where a tremendous amount of the health value is in our foods, of live foods. And there's a whole different host of compounds. The one that I'm going to talk about are flavonoids. And flavonoids is basically a label for hundreds, if not thousands, of different plant constituents that have various effects in the human body. So specifically antioxidant and anti-inflammatory. And when I say antioxidant, I mean it quells any sort of tissue damaging process, as does anti-inflammatory, kind of, but a different relationship more with the immune system. So these are major players in those pathways in our body. And it turns out that the best sources of that in the fruit world are berries. So blackberries, strawberries, raspberries, huckleberries, blueberries. These are if you're going to eat fruit on a regular basis, these are the ones that I usually point people towards. They have low sugar content and are just loaded with all of these flavonoids, antioxidants, anti-inflammatory compounds. In the vegetable world, green leafy vegetables, great place to get them. But the specific set of compounds that I really like for what I'll call phytonutrients is the cruciferous family of vegetables. So that's broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, kale, bok choy, collard greens. This is all part of that cruciferous family. They have this really great compound called DIM in them, D-I-M, which does an awesome job of metabolizing estrogens and generally supporting liver detoxification. So, and also really high concentrations of all those other flavonoids as well. So really good family of vegetables to highly focus on from that perspective. Also in the realm of calcium, that family is really good too because a great source of calcium is vegetables, but the problem is other things like spinach and other green leafy vegetables, they have what are called oxalates in them. So they prevent calcium absorption. So even though there's a lot of calcium in those foods, you don't absorb it well. So that's where that cruciferous family is great. Just a little segue for calcium. So all of the different colors of our vegetables and fruits, really good to, quote unquote, eat from the rainbow because that really means that you're capturing a bunch of different unique flavonoids and phytochemicals. So a good rule of thumb is to eat from the rainbow in the sense that you want to capture all those different groups. So purple vegetables and white vegetables and orange and green You know, really go through the rainbow. Red, because you're capturing all of these plant nutrients, which, you know, there's literally millions of them, and we've only studied a small number of them. But we know very well that they, from the very small number we've studied, that they confer immense health benefits and almost no health detriments, right? So, again, that's the realm of flavonoids that we're kind of starting with. Now, nuts and seeds and legumes also have a lot of flavonoids, so I don't want to leave those out as good sources. And then the last kind of peripheral topic that I want to just skim the surface of is essential fatty acids. And specifically, I'm going to mention omega-3 fatty acids just because it's like this buzzword. Everyone's taking fish oil and, you know, as a supplement. And what about all that? Where's the food sources of it? Okay. So again, let's back up 1 second and say, what are essential fatty acids? They're fats that our body cannot make on its own. So you have to get them from the diet. There's two different kinds of essential fatty acids. One are called the omega-6 family, and the other are called the omega-3 family. Now, we need the omega-6 family to live. They're critical. They have many health properties. But the problem is in modern society, in a modern food industry, we've multiplied the amplitude of omega-6s in our diet 20-fold. So what ends up happening is, you know, everyone knows about ibuprofen when you're in pain, used as an anti-inflammatory. Well, what that does is it blocks inflammatory pathways. But if you go upstream of that, the inflammatory pathway starts with the types of fat that are in your cells. And it turns out that omega-6 type of fat is much more inflammatory when it's in high concentrations than the omega-3s. And so the concept there is, if you want to get more to the cause of inflammation, you want to think about the types of fats you're eating, not even necessarily supplementing, but actually eating. And in that sense, that's where it's really critical to know the pathways and the types of foods that create that. And so if you start from oils and seeds like flaxseed, perilla seed, borage oil, walnut seed, or walnut oil, these are very, very concentrated sources of omega-3 fats, and they're called alpha-linoleic acid is actually what it's called. And so in order to convert that into the cellular compound that is anti-inflammatory, it has to go through a lot of conversions. So only about 5% of that actually converts to the active anti-inflammatory, which are called EPA and DHA. That's fish oil, okay? And I know that this is getting pretty complex here, but I'm just trying to finish. So what we're after is EPA and DHA. Those are the anti-inflammatory omega-3s. But to get there, we ideally get it from a balanced source of, first of all, nuts and seeds and plant-based oils, but also from some animal-based products. The best of those omega-3s being fatty fish. Okay, so salmon, sardines, mackerel, these are those oily fish. They have, basically those fish have eaten all the algae in the ocean and done all the conversions for you. So what's sitting in their tissue is straight EPA and DHA. And so if you really want to concentrate nutritionally, I'll tell patients, you know, eat healthy fats in your diet, maybe eat salmon or sardines a couple times a week, and you're doing a fish oil supplement right there. I mean, there's like, in a serving of 3 or 4 ounces of salmon, there's like 4 or 5 grams of EPA-DHA combination. And most supplemental fish oils are really low quality, so you got to be really picky about where you get them. So that's a little bit about kind of the omega-3s. Now, what do? I talked about the main kind of role as an anti-inflammatory. So in that sense, they're great for any sort of inflammatory condition like heart disease, high blood pressure, high lipids, any sort of aging-related disease like cognition issues, dementia, any sort of neurological disease like depression or anxiety or nerve conduction issues, numbness, weakness. What else do we use fish oil for? So many things, but that's a starting point. So a lot of good reasons to have essential fatty acids in the form of omega-3s.
Is low quality fish oil that you mentioned you got to be careful about?
Yeah, because remember how we talked.
Is it harmful, or is it just that it's not doing what good quality?
It's actually harmful. Yeah, and that has to do with the fact that we talked about how fragile oils are, and omega-3s are very fragile oils. So most of the processing of those oils makes them rancid. Like if you smell your fish oil supplement and it smells like fish, it's not a good supplement. It's the one supplement I'll actually open my patient's bottle and smell it, because you can tell right there if it's been gone rancid, or if you burp after you eat fish oil, fish burps, it's rancid. It's not good.
Is the krill oil any better? The krill oil?
Can be, depends on the source. Yeah. Krill oil. Yep. So, and then there's toxins that get into fish oil and Fukushima, and there's a lot to kind of go into there, but I just wanted to kind of amplify the concept of essential fatty acids and where we derive them from, particularly the omega-3s. Right.
What's the source of the omega-6s? You said they...
The same kind of sources. I mean, but the big source that's amplified in our modern diet is conventionally raised meat.
Okay.
That's what's really put it over the top. And of course, we consume way more meat than we should, so we consume way more omega-6s than we should.
And you want a balance between the omega-6s?
Yeah, you want about a 2-to-1 balance, and the typical American diet is about a 20-to-1 balance. That's why we're more inflammatory prone, right?
2-to-1, 3-to-6?
Yeah, 2-to-1 of 6-to-3. So a little more 6 than 3. I mean, an ideal one we could argue is even about 1-to-1, but our ancestral diet is about 2-to-1. Yeah. Okay. Yes?
You mentioned nuts and seeds a lot. Do they have to be in raw form, like not dry roasted or oil roasted?
Yeah, that's a good question. I thought about food preparation mentioning that. What I advocate to my patients is to very, very slowly, with low heat, roast your nuts and seeds, or soak them or sprout them. And the reason being is that if you heat them too high, you oxidize all those fats, right? That's bad news. But if you heat them really low and slow, like oven on 200 degrees for an hour or so, flipping them once, then you're minimizing the oxidation. Or probably the best way is to soak stuff overnight or sprout them even better. Because what you do is you remove the agents that prevent absorption. They're called phytates, and nuts and seeds have a lot of those. So if you have them in the raw form, great roughage, some nutrient value, but you lose a lot of it too because they get bound up by the phytates. Angie?
So I actually eat sprouted almonds.
Wonderful.
That I love, but I can't figure out how do they get their crunch then? I mean, they taste like they're roasted and they're not.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the best way to do it.
Okay.
If you're disciplined enough to sprout. Yeah, it's a good way to go.
I don't sprout them. I eat
Oh, you eat them sprouted.
Yeah, yeah.
That's right, yeah, they have huckleberries.
Where do you buy them?
Huckleberries was some, Jeannie was mentioning over in Spokane. I don't know if Pilgrims has them here. I have to double check. I haven't seen them here. Yeah. So yeah, good question. That's how to go with those.
Is there a better, nuts, in the nuts family, better nuts as opposed to like macadamia nuts?
Yeah, well,
cashews?
you know, again, that's where it gets really personalized. And I would say...
All nuts are good?
What's that?
Are all nuts good?
Well, I mean, again, it's an individual question. Generally speaking, you got to be careful with cashews because it has a way higher carb content than all the other nuts. And you got to be wary about peanuts because peanuts are a misnomer. They're actually a legume. And a lot of people are sensitive to them just as a lot of people are sensitive to cashews. So it's nuanced, right? I mean, if you know, I usually start with someone's blood type to really help determine that. But, you know, that's more of an individual question. Any other questions about fats or essential fatty acids before we move on? Okay. So now we've got to the point where we can knock through the vitamins and minerals. That's what we're going to wrap up with. So I'm going to skip over a few just because I wanted to kind of hit the big ones. But there are trace minerals that I'm not going to talk about that are in our foods. There are some trace vitamins that I don't consider many people deficient in or don't have very specific medicinal values that I'm not going to include. But I'm going to hit a lot of the biggies. Okay. So I'm going to start in the realm of vitamins. Just to keep groups together, I'm going to go with water-soluble vitamins first, as opposed to fat-soluble. Now that's an important distinction to know, first of all, is that vitamins that are water-soluble means they run through your system quickly, means you can't create a toxic overload because you can't consume it quick enough to be toxic, really. But it also means that, to therapeutically use them, you want to do it throughout the day. That more pertains to supplementation, but just to distinguish. Whereas fat-soluble can actually store in the tissue. So one of the things, I'll mention is, it's pretty hard to do this, but you could actually overdose on vitamin A foods, I suppose, if you went crazy. But there are ways to have toxicity, usually not from diet. It's usually when you supplement that can occur. And so for our purposes, you don't really need to worry about that. But you do need to eat fat-soluble vitamins or foods, ideally with a fatty meal, because that helps absorb it better. In other words, fat-soluble vitamins need bile from the gallbladder to absorb, and your gallbladder doesn't secrete bile unless you have a meal. So, I guess, again, it's not something you have to worry about if you're trying to do nutrition just from food, because you're eating this fat-soluble vitamins with food. But if you were supplementing, that would be a different matter, right? So, just a couple of initial precursors. So the first family I'm going to talk about are the B vitamins. This is a family of vitamins, and I always tell people if you're going to supplement the Bs, supplement the whole family because they all work together with each other. But I am going to break down a few of the main B vitamins in their food sources and some of their health kind of properties and or diseases they can treat. So the first one is B3 or niacin. Very interesting vitamin. This is kind of one of the very original vitamins that was used to do what's called orthomolecular medicine or concentrated vitamins for treatments. And it actually started, the guy's name was Hofner. He started using super high doses of niacin to treat anxiety, schizophrenia, depression. So in mental health, B3 has a major role as a cofactor in creating hormones and neurotransmitters. It also has a major role, like all of the B vitamins do, in metabolism and energy production pathways. So in that sense, it's a great thing to use a B3 in the realm of fatigue or some sort of metabolic issues. Specifically, B3 has a lot of efficacy in the treatment of hypercholesterolemia or high cholesterol, as well as high triglycerides and high LDL. And it has the ability to raise HDL, your good cholesterol. So in a subset of patients, you got to be careful because it can also raise blood sugar a little bit, but in certain types of cholesterol issues, niacin can be a great therapeutic agent. So in terms of where we get niacin from our food, it's in meat, it's in fish, it's in legumes and dairy. It can also be in green leafies. So this is a place where you're going to hear when I go through these, you're going to hear me say meat almost every time. I don't want you to get the impression that, well, geez, I should just be eating meat all day, right? It's just because, again, the concept of animal products concentrate everything, including nutrients, right? They've done a lot of the work for us already because they've already digested those plants. So just because I say that doesn't mean you should eat a bunch of meat. But at the same time, it also means that it is very challenging to be completely vegan and have a full nutrient balanced diet. You have to work very hard at it because these animal products provide highly accessible, highly concentrated nutrients in our food. So you'll always hear me mention that, but that doesn't necessarily mean eat more meat. Got it? Okay. So that's B3 or niacin. The next one that's worth mentioning that has a lot of clinical use is vitamin B6 or pyridoxine, but it's mostly goes by B6. Pyridoxine, like B3, major metabolic initiator, so energy breakdown, energy creation, B vitamin's big there. B6 is also really big in psychological pathways. So hormones, neurotransmitters, B6 is another major cofactor you need. So depression, anxiety, PMS, particularly female hormone-related stuff, B6 plays a big role. So I usually will emphasize B6 in like a supplement for some people for that reason. Plays a major role with neurological function. A lot of people with peripheral neuropathy respond very well to B6, as well as they do to B12, another really good one. And it has some important cardiovascular function too. All the B vitamins are antioxidants, and so in that sense, they remove oxidative damage. So things like heart disease, a lot of it has to do with oxidation, right? Cholesterol isn't bad until it gets oxidized. So taking on good concentrations of things like B vitamins, antioxidants, right? Same thing with all those flavonoids we talked about. Good sources of B6, very similar to the B3, except banana is one that's particularly high in B6 for some reason. And I think there's one specific nut, but I forgot what it is. So folate. Folate's another B vitamin. We think of it a lot with pregnant moms because one of folate's main roles is cell division. So for our cells to divide healthy, the DNA needs to use a lot of folic acid and a lot of B12. And so in that sense, obviously having a healthy baby means really good cell division. And so we supplement folate in moms. But it also has a lot of other roles to play. So any disease where there needs to be a lot of cell turnover, like cervical dysplasia or some sort of precancerous process, folate's a really good nutrient to use. It has a major role to play in cardiovascular disease because the main way that we neutralize oxidative species is with folate and B12. Those are major cofactors. So another big role in cardiovascular disease, folate. Important role in osteoporosis. I use a formula that includes folate there. Good sources. This is a little different. Not so much in the realm of animal products, but green leafy vegetables is a great source of folic acid. And this is a place where cooking methodology does matter. So if you cook the veggies, the greens, you lose about 60% of the folic acid. So ideally that's, doing some of those leafy greens in the raw form. Questions about folate? Yeah.
I have a question about, she said all of them are good with meats. Do you have some specific meats choices that are better than others?
Well, again, that becomes an individual question, right? So, I mean, concentration-wise, they're all pretty equivalent, but I'm going to gear people way more towards fish, generally speaking, and poultry like eggs versus a lot of red meats. But a certain subset of my patients, I'm going to say, yeah, and red meat's great too. So it just really depends there. Yeah?
If something's organic, does that mean it also doesn't have hormones or antibiotics in it?
That's correct. That's one of the definitions. No pesticides, no antibiotics, no hormones can be used.
Which is a good thing.
That is a good thing, yes. Indeed. Okay, so last B vitamin I'm going to talk about, B12. B12 is very interesting because it is probably the most complex vitamin absorption-wise speaking. You actually have to get something called intrinsic factor in the stomach, which requires hydrochloric acid to release. The intrinsic factor binds the B12 and then gets absorbed in the small intestine. So people with stomach acid issues can become very deficient in B12. The other very unique thing about B12 is when I was mentioning it's hard to be a vegan with full nutritional balance, this is the most diminished nutrient for vegans because really the only sources of B12 are animal products. Technically, you could somehow get it from algae a little bit, but you kind of really have to supplement B12 if you're a vegan because it only comes from animal sources. And there's lots of it in animal sources, but that's the main way you get it. B12, like folate, really important for cell division, really important for psychological conditions, really important for cardiovascular disease, to name a few. Major immune role as well. So antimicrobial, really good at fighting viruses. B12 can do a great job of that. Okay. Any questions about the bees? Yeah.
And you get B12 from eggs?
You can. That's an animal product, yeah.
What do you say about B17?
B17. Sorry, is it under a different name?
Yes, it is, but I don't remember it. It's one that Griffin does, recommends. It's the apricot pit,
Yeah, I'm drawing a blank right now on it. It's not biotin. Yeah, I'm drawing a blank, sorry.
From the person.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry. Okay, so we're still on vitamins. Last water-soluble vitamin is vitamin C. So, interestingly, many animals have the ability to synthesize vitamin C in their own bodies, kind of like how we can synthesize our own vitamin D. That's why I'm not going to talk about vitamin D because you don't really get it from your food, you got to make it. But vitamin C, historically, humans somehow lost that adaptation. The speculation, it was plentiful enough in our diets that we didn't need to make our own anymore. But it also begs the argument that it's a really essential nutrient to consume. And it's used therapeutically in a lot of conditions, usually in very high doses. So we think about, almost everyone knows vitamin C in the immune system, right? Big role there. So major antimicrobial, major anti-cancer properties. It'll actually go after cancer. Major antioxidant. Also, kind of in a different way, it's great to loosen up someone's bowels. Everyone knows if they've taken a lot of vitamin C that there's a limit to which you can take before you stop absorbing it as a supplement. Of course, when it's in food, that never happens. So, vitamin C food sources. Probably the best source is citrus. So lemons, limes, grapefruits, oranges. Those are probably the most concentrated. Other fruits have a good concentration as well. And leafy green vegetables and cruciferous have a pretty good chunk of them too. So those are the main kind of places we're getting vitamin C in our diet.
Can you talk for a second about liposomal C?
Yeah. Liposomal C is the context, and this is again as a supplement, that you can take vitamin C essentially that's been emulsified, which is what is essentially like a soap bubble, right? It's coated, the vitamin C, in a fat. And so the concept is to use vitamin C therapeutically, we want it actually absorbing into the cells versus just in the intracellular space. And so to absorb it into the cells, it has to pass a lipid membrane. And to pass that lipid membrane, the thought goes, if it's in a fat-soluble form, a lot more of that vitamin C is actually going to get into the cell. So you don't need to take as much.
It's a more usable form.
It's a more usable form, but it's a lot more costly.
Yeah.
So,
but it's still water soluble, not a fat.
Well, it's been emulsified. So, I mean, it's like anything. You can make anything fat soluble by sticking different fat soluble ends onto it. And that's what liposomal is doing.
So it is a fat soluble C versus.
Yes, it is. Correct. Correct. Yeah. And so you can take a lot less, and theoretically, the science is definitely mixed there in terms of concentrations. But you know, some people swear by it. I don't personally dispense it because it's pretty costly, and I like to do a lot of ascorbate form of vitamin C, which is well absorbed, and just put in water and space it through the day. Sure. But yeah, so that's a little bit about C. Again, many uses, but I'll stop it there. The two fat-soluble vitamins I want to mention are vitamin A and vitamin K. Vitamin A is interesting in that it's one of those vitamins where even though it's fat-soluble, your body can convert it from bioflavonoids. And so what ends up happening with vitamin A, or I should say carotenoids are what they're called, and named after the carrot, right? It has a lot of carotenoids in it. But carotenoids get converted beta-carotene in the body to vitamin A. So that's one of our major sources of vitamin A, but it's a pretty low conversion rate, like the essential fatty acids to make EPA. But the plant, or the animal sources that is direct vitamin A is liver, dairy, and eggs, pretty much the biggest sources. You can become toxic. It's really hard to do by eating food, so it's probably not something to worry about. But the things that I like to use vitamin A for is in the treatment of acne, eczema, any sort of skin issue, really good there. Very, very good for the immune system. Really good during colds and flus. Vitamin A is, as well as a great nutrient in the realm of vision, which is something a lot of us are familiar with. Major antioxidant, major anti-inflammatory, so really good there too. Questions about A? Okay. Vitamin K is the other one I want to mention. Vitamin K is, we know it about in the relation to clotting factors. So if you're on a blood thinner, you might have heard your doctor say, don't eat leafy green vegetables because it'll interfere with your drug. I think that that's because of all the factors that confound that statement. I don't believe that. I think that it's one thing if you're eating pounds of kale or something. Yeah, that's a lot of vitamin K, or pounds of celery, but it's really foolish to tell people, you know, don't eat a healthy diet because it's going to interact with this one medicine that, I don't know. So anyways, vitamin K is used in clotting factors, and that's one of its major purposes. So people with bleeding disorders, I mean, theoretically, vitamin K rich foods are really important. But the other place that I like to use it is in the realm of bones. We're learning that a lot of healthy bone formation is really vitamin K dependent. And so in that sense, there's different types of vitamin K. The main food source we should think about is from green leafy vegetables, fibrous vegetables basically. Really high vitamin K content, but also there is an animal form too that's a little more absorbable into the matrix of the bones, which is vitamin K2, and that comes from basically animal sources. So any form of meat or poultry or dairy has vitamin K2 in it. Okay, questions about K? Yeah.
Banana's a good source of that?
Bananas? Not necessarily. They have some vitamin K, but not highly concentrated. Yeah. Okay. Before I go on to the minerals, I'm going to mention one that's a little bit in between, which is potassium. You mentioned bananas, and I like to point out that everyone just is always like, oh, bananas and potassium, right? Like it's the only source of potassium, which always makes me chuckle because, I mean, bananas are really sweet, so I would, you know, oh, there's potassium, I should eat it. And it does have a lot of potassium, it's true. But so do a lot of other plant sources, right? Pretty much any fibrous vegetable is like 98% potassium, 2% sodium, right? So when you're talking about electrolyte balancing, when you're talking about high blood pressure, when you're talking about overactive muscles or nervous system, potassium's a really good electrolyte to focus on. So it's great for muscle cramps, it's great for high blood pressure, it's great for fatigue. It's a really important nutrient there to focus on. And again, just eat vegetables and you get all the potassium you need. But why do Americans have so much high blood pressure and stuff? It's because they don't eat vegetables and they eat foods, processed foods loaded with sodium. And the kidneys get overworked and they can't balance blood volume. By the way, I should have mentioned this as an overarching concept with B vitamins. Because it makes energy, fatigue obviously is a huge area of intervention for B vitamins. That's, if you're wanting more energy, really good place to start is, focusing on B vitamin rich foods. Okay, any questions about potassium? All right, I'm not going to talk about D because we don't get it from food really. So a separate topic, and I want to try to do the minerals in the next 5 minutes here, so then you have to get out of here too late, so let's run through them. So calcium is obviously one macro mineral we think about. We all think, oh, you have to eat dairy to get calcium. Not true. There's a lot of other really good sources of calcium. We talked about those cruciferous veggies. We talked about fish. We talked about any sort of animal protein. Great sources of calcium. You can get nuts and seeds have lots. Legumes have lots. You can get plenty of calcium from other foods without drinking milk. Kids included. So main thing we think about for calcium, healthy bones and teeth. That's critical role there. There's other things it does, but I think that's the main place to focus. Now magnesium, on the other hand, this is kind of Pandora's box in terms of how many health benefits we gather from magnesium. It also happens to be the nutrient that is the most depleted in our soils. So it's hard to get enough from our food. I'll make a caveat there. It's one mineral that I tell pretty much everyone to supplement. Number one, because the soils are devitalized. Number two, because it has so many health benefits. So I've listed out just a few of them. And really, I guess I'll talk about the physiology. Magnesium is the relaxing mineral. So it relaxes tissues. So that has a role to play in all sorts of conditions related to tension. Anything from muscle cramps to stress-related illness to high blood pressure to cardiovascular disease, even to things like migraine. Magnesium is great there. Asthma, tensed up bronchioles, great treatment for asthma. It also has a lot of metabolic value. It is a cofactor in every single reaction we do in our bodies to make energy. It's like a cofactor in like 400 different reactions. So major role to play there. I also love magnesium for sleep. It's very calming, and probably 50% of my patients will take care of sleep issues. Of course, that's as a supplement. Now, as a food source, the things we're really looking at for magnesium, nuts, legumes, grains, vegetables, good sources there of magnesium. Okay.
How about banana?
Banana, a little bit, but not much. Yeah.
Like those.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Which form is best to take if you're going to supplement?
I like glycinate.
Glycinate?
Glycinate, yeah, Glycinate.
Is that different than chelated? Or is that
Yeah, it is. Yeah, chelated is a pretty good way to do it too, but glycinate, the science is pretty good there with that one. It's, I think, the most well absorbed. It's what I distribute at my clinic.
I was on citrate, I was on one that said it can make your bowels dependent on...
Yeah, citrate or oxide. Oxide's the worst, citrate's just a step above. So a lot of you are familiar with like Calm's magnesium.
Yeah.
That's citrate. So it's okay, it's better than oxide, but it can be habit forming, and it's not the one that I guide people towards. Yeah.
The one that you guide
I'm sorry.
towards, is that not habit forming?
Not as much, not nearly as much, yeah. I mean, if you're taking a lot of it, I suppose it could be, but my experience with it is not to be the case. And again, because we all should take magnesium, I tell people to take it long term. I mean, I'm not like take it for 3 months. I'm pretty much like we should all take magnesium. So.
Well, if you have,
Certain amount that we should take?
Oh, as a supplement, I usually recommend between 200 and 400 milligrams at night. Yeah.
if you take too much, you'll end up in the pot pretty quick.
Yeah, that's what we've been talking about, the bowel dependence. Yeah.
But isn't that more on the citrate level than versus?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm sorry, can I just jump to the calcium? Because that's,
Yeah.
when you're talking about the different forms, isn't there also different?
Same story, yeah. And again, this is that realm of that whole other lecture of like supplements and how much to learn. I mean, all those B vitamins I talked about, there's sources and forms and absorbability and fillers. I mean, there's a lot to go into there. So yeah, it's a challenging one. I just want to talk about magnesium because I don't think we can get enough from our food with how depleted our soils have become. Yeah.
Is there something between calcium and magnesium, like a ratio or something to have them?
Yeah, I like a 1-to-1 ratio.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah. So next mineral is iron. We all think about iron in relation to pregnancy or anemia, right? The main physiological role of iron is that it's part of hemoglobin, which is what our blood cells that carry our oxygen and have a lot of other roles. Also plays a big role in the immune system. So that's why it actually causes oxidation. It kills microbes. That's why males should never supplement with iron because they don't tend towards anemia. They don't have a menstrual cycle every month, and that iron is potentially oxidizing and damaging to their tissues. That's supplementation again. When we go to food sources, or the uses, so we talked about anemia, which fatigue is a major symptom of anemia. So if you're anemic and you are fatigued, then iron could really help. Alopecia, hair loss, again, if you're iron deficient, iron can be a huge player there. Restless legs, same story. Mood, same story. So this is an interesting nutrient because we're talking more about when there is deficiency, supplementing or adding more iron-rich foods would be ideal. Yeah.
When you donate blood, they always test your iron?
Yeah.
And they have a figure for it?
Yeah, because if you have too little or too much, then because it has such a strong relationship to the blood, it can't be used as a transfusion. And there's conditions, obviously, of anemia and of iron overload that exist out there. So iron sources, obviously red meat is probably the most dense source of heme iron, which is, obviously it came from flesh, so it's already in hemoglobin. It's already put together, which makes it very much more usable by the body. Doesn't have to be red meat, it can be poultry, it can be fish, it can be eggs, they all contain iron. Red meat probably has a little bit more. There is plant sources as well. It's called non-heme iron. And leafy green veggies are probably the best source there. However, for a concentrated kind of supplement-like food is blackstrap molasses. It's way more absorbed than other plant-based irons. And I think like a tablespoon has like 4 milligrams or 3 milligrams of iron in it. So pretty good if you wanted to do some supplementing there. You can cook on a cast iron skillet. You get some non-heme iron there, but it's also kind of it's non-ionized, so it's pretty hard for the body to utilize, but you can get some that way too. So that's iron. Questions? Okay. A couple more, and then we're done. Zinc. Really important macro mineral, particularly plentiful in seafood, in meat. Pumpkin seeds have a particularly high amount of zinc in them, as well as other nuts and seeds. Beans, legumes, all have plenty of zinc in them. Zinc has a lot of roles to play in the body. It's major for the immune system. It's really important for skin healing. It has a major role to play in reproduction. Spermatogenesis requires a lot of zinc. And so any sort of male reproductive issues, we definitely think about zinc. Definitely a role in vision. And also I really like to use zinc in treating skin conditions like acne, as well as internal skin conditions like, for example, ulcers respond really well to zinc. So just a few ideas of why zinc is so important. Deficient in a lot of Americans' diets, so good to seek out those foods high in zinc. Selenium, another trace, it's more of a trace mineral. I want to mention it because there's such vital roles to play as an antioxidant. It's major in liver antioxidant pathways, so it's really important, for example, in cardiovascular disease. It also is a major cofactor in the production of thyroid hormone. So if there's a potential thyroid issue, adding selenium-rich foods is probably a good idea. And selenium. Oh, cancer is another really good place for selenium, again, because of its major antioxidant role. Now, interestingly, if you eat 2 Brazil nuts, you get double your daily value of selenium. So, like Brazil nuts, and you want to use a food to supplement selenium, you could do it that way. Other nuts and seeds, as well as grains, have quite a bit of selenium. Meat and fish as well. So, another nutrient I wanted to mention. And last of all, iodine. Again, from a therapeutic standpoint, there's really 2 things I think about with iodine. One is hypothyroidism. Thyroid hormone is made with iodine as a central part of its backbone. So the leading cause of hypothyroidism worldwide is iodine deficiency. In America, that's not what it is, it's more inflammatory. But nevertheless, iodine deficiency can still be part of thyroid issues. The other place is fibrocystic breasts. So that's another place where we found clinically iodine to be very useful. The best sources concentrated of it from food is seaweed, sea kelp. So if you're into trying out, a little seaweed in some sort of stew, or if you want to make sushi, have a little nori, good sources of iodine. It also exists in other foods. It exists in nuts and seeds, in eggs, in fish, in dairy and meat. So you can get iodine in other places too. You don't have to eat seaweed. But if you wanted to use it like a food grade supplement, you could put seaweed in your food, or eat a little seaweed. Questions about those last couple I went over? Yeah.
How reliable are the thyroid tests at the doctor's office?
Well, that's a big question, but I don't think that video ended up getting recorded, unfortunately. I did a whole lecture on it a few months ago, just thyroid and adrenals. But what I would say is it's not that they're not reliable, they're just incomplete. So that conventional doctors usually just test TSH. But to get a full picture of what's going on in the thyroid, you have to test a lot more than just TSH at a very baseline free T3 and free T4. Certain individuals, if they have hypothyroidism, might also want to look for thyroid antibodies. So it's not that those tests aren't accurate, they're just don't give you the whole picture. Yeah. Okay. So I know we ran a little over, so I kind of apologize for holding you guys late tonight. Thanks for staying. I am now going to take some time to go over these questions that people came in with. So just, to give everyone an opportunity, if you want to scoot, go ahead and scoot. We have a lot of information about the clinic in the back, and check out our website. Thank you for being here. And for those of you who want to stay, stick around and we'll go over these questions. Thanks. Okay, so the first question was cataract prevention. Who's the question there? Okay, cataract prevention. So cataracts are really a consequence of oxidative damage in the eye tissues. And so oxidation, remember we were talking about antioxidants during the lecture. So if we want to prevent oxidative damage, we want to eat a lot of antioxidants. So all those good vegetables, good fruits that we talked about, and then of course adjunctive antioxidants, like there's some very specific ones to the eye. Bilberry is an example, but lutein is another example. Vitamin A, B vitamins. So all these antioxidant compounds we can actually concentrate. And we actually use a formula at the clinic we call iRenew that has like all the stuff I really like put together. Zinc is another one. It's important. So I generally use a formula like that. And of course, prevention, probably way beyond that, and much more important, is glycemic control. Because what causes oxidation in the body more than anything is poorly regulated blood sugar. So same story, someone had a question about dementia, I think, somewhere. Same story, man. You gotta get glycemic levels dialed in the bloodstream. That's huge.
Are you talking too low and too high, or just too high, or?
Too high.
Okay.
Hardly anyone is too low. It's exceedingly rare in our carb crazy diet. So American diet. But it happens, it's just rare. Yeah.
Was there any drops, natural drops or something like?
Yeah, I use an eye drop too, something called cataract eye drop. It's homeopathic. It does very well for some patients. So we do have that at the clinic as well. And it's inexpensive and easy to use. Yep.
Does
Yeah.
exercise play a role in that too? Because you just increase your oxygen and doesn't that help?
Well, I would say that circulation plays a role in every health condition. It's why I call it a fundamental determinant of health. Is that if we're not circulating our blood well, then we're not doing nutrient exchange and the tissues aren't getting what they need or being able to get rid of what they need to. And so, in a sense, yes, it applies there. Someone had a question about the nightshade family? Oh yeah, okay. So nightshades is a specific class of vegetables. It's potatoes, tomatoes, eggplants, and peppers. And they happen to have a lot of lectins